What if I told you that one of Hollywood's most beloved superheroes was murdered in cold blood, and the entire entertainment industry conspired to cover it up? The death of George Reeves, television's first Superman, remains one of the most shocking and suspicious celebrity deaths in history. But here's what they don't want you to know about what really happened on that fateful night in June 1959. Picture this: a man who could leap tall buildings in a single bound, who stood for truth, justice, and the American way, found dead in his bedroom with a single gunshot wound to the head. The official story? Suicide. But when you dig deeper into the evidence, examine the crime scene, and look at who George Reeves really was and the dangerous people he was connected to, a much darker picture emerges. George Reeves wasn't just Superman on television. He was a man caught in a web of Hollywood corruption, organized crime connections, and a love triangle that would make any soap opera jealous. And on the night of June 16, 1959, that web finally closed around him in the most permanent way possible. Let me take you back to that night. George Reeves was at his Benedict Canyon home, supposedly celebrating his upcoming marriage to socialite Leonore Lemon. But as the evening progressed, something went terribly wrong. According to the official police report, Reeves excused himself, went upstairs to his bedroom, and shot himself with a Luger pistol. Case closed, right? Wrong. The first red flag that should make your blood run cold is the crime scene itself. When police arrived, they found something that defied all logic. The spent bullet casing was found under Reeves's body. Think about that for a moment. When a gun is fired, the shell casing ejects backward and to the right. For it to end up underneath the victim's body, either the laws of physics were suspended that night, or someone placed it there after the fact. But that's just the beginning of the inconsistencies that will blow your mind. The gunshot wound was located on the right side of Reeves's head, yet he was left-handed. While it's not impossible for someone to use their non-dominant hand, it's certainly unusual, especially for such a final act. The angle of the wound also suggested the gun was held at a distance, not pressed against the temple as you'd expect in a typical suicide. Here's where things get really sinister. George Reeves wasn't just any actor. He was involved with Toni Manx, the wife of Eddie Manx, one of Hollywood's most powerful and ruthless executives. Eddie Manx wasn't just a studio boss. He was connected to organized crime figures and had a reputation for making problems disappear permanently. When Reeves began his affair with Toni, he didn't just cross a powerful man. He crossed someone with the resources and connections to eliminate threats. The relationship between George Reeves and Toni Manx had been going on for years. She was his sugar mama, funding his lifestyle, buying him cars, and even purchasing the house where he would eventually die. But by 1959, Reeves was trying to break free from this arrangement. He was planning to marry Leonore Lemon and start fresh. For Eddie Manx, this represented a potential problem. What if Reeves decided to talk about what he knew? What if he revealed the dark secrets of Hollywood's power structure? Let's examine the timeline of events that night, because the official story has more holes than Swiss cheese. According to witness testimony, Reeves went upstairs around midnight. But here's what doesn't add up. The neighbors reported hearing not one gunshot, but multiple gunshots throughout the evening. When questioned about this, the witnesses suddenly developed selective amnesia, claiming they only heard one shot at the time of Reeves's death. Even more suspicious is the behavior of the people in the house that night. Leonore Lemon, Reeves's fiancée, showed no emotion when the gunshot was heard. In fact, according to witness accounts, she seemed to know what was coming. She allegedly told the other guests that Reeves was going upstairs to kill himself before the shot was even fired. How could she possibly know that unless the whole thing was planned. The investigation itself was a complete sham from the very beginning. The lead detective assigned to the case was a man named Jerry LeMay, who had known connections to Eddie Manx and the studio system. Instead of treating the scene as a potential homicide, LeMay immediately classified it as a suicide. No fingerprints were taken from the gun. No gunpowder residue tests were performed. The crime scene was contaminated almost immediately, with people walking through it freely. But here's the most chilling detail that will make you question everything you thought you knew about Hollywood justice. George Reeves had been receiving death threats in the weeks leading up to his murder. He had confided to friends that he feared for his life. He had even hired a bodyguard, though conveniently, the bodyguard wasn't present on the night he died. The cover-up extended far beyond just the police investigation. The media, which was largely controlled by the same studio system that Eddie Manx represented, immediately began pushing the suicide narrative. Articles appeared in newspapers across the country, describing Reeves as a depressed actor who couldn't escape his Superman typecasting. But people who knew Reeves personally painted a completely different picture. They described him as optimistic about his future, excited about his upcoming marriage, and actively pursuing new career opportunities. Let's talk about the physical evidence that was either ignored or deliberately suppressed. There were unexplained bruises on Reeves's body that suggested a struggle. The trajectory of the bullet didn't match what you'd expect from a self-inflicted wound. Multiple witnesses reported seeing unfamiliar cars in the neighborhood that night, cars that were never investigated or identified. The most damning evidence might be what happened to the people who tried to speak out. Reeves's mother, Helen Bessilow, never believed the suicide story. She hired private investigators and pushed for a new investigation. But every lead seemed to hit a dead end. Witnesses suddenly became unavailable or changed their stories. Evidence disappeared from police files. It was as if an invisible hand was orchestrating the cover-up from behind the scenes. Here's something that will absolutely shock you. Years later, a former Los Angeles police detective named Jerry LeMay, the same man who had ruled Reeves's death a suicide, admitted privately that he believed Reeves had been murdered. But by then, the case was long closed, and the truth was buried under decades of Hollywood mythology. The motive becomes crystal clear when you understand the power dynamics at play. George Reeves wasn't just threatening to leave Tony Manx. He was potentially threatening the entire system that Eddie Manx represented. In 1959, Hollywood was still firmly under the control of a small group of powerful men who would do anything to protect their interests. If Reeves had lived and married Leonore Lemon, he might have felt emboldened to reveal what he knew about Hollywood's dark underbelly. But the cover-up goes even deeper than just protecting Eddie Manx. The Superman television series was incredibly valuable intellectual property. If the star was revealed to have been murdered, especially in connection with organized crime figures, it could have destroyed the franchise entirely. The financial stakes were enormous, providing even more motivation for a cover-up. Consider this timeline of suspicious events. 3 months before his death, Reeves had expressed concerns about his safety to close friends. 2 months before, he had hired additional security. 1 month before, he had changed his will, leaving everything to Tony Manx rather than his fiancée. And then, just weeks before his death, he suddenly fired his bodyguard and dismissed his concerns about threats against his life. The psychological profile doesn't match either. Suicide victims typically show signs of depression, hopelessness, and social withdrawal. But George Reeves was actively planning his future. He had just signed a contract to appear at store openings and public events. He was discussing potential television and film projects with his agent. He had ordered a new convertible and was planning an elaborate honeymoon with Leonore. What's even more telling is what happened immediately after Reeves's death. Tony Manx inherited the house where he died, along with most of his possessions. She continued to live there for years, surrounded by reminders of her dead lover. Some might call this devotion, but others might see it as the behavior of someone who knew exactly what had happened and why. The final piece of evidence that proves this was murder, disguised as suicide, involves the gun itself. The Luger pistol found at the scene belonged to Tony Manx. She had given it to Reeves months earlier, allegedly for protection. But ballistics experts who examined the weapon years later found something interesting. The gun had been fired multiple times recently, not just once, as the official story claimed. Here's what some believe really happened that night in Benedict Canyon. George Reeves had finally decided to completely break free from the Manx family influence. He was going to marry Leonore and start a new chapter of his life. But Eddie Manx couldn't allow that to happen. Too much was at stake. So he arranged for professional killers to visit Reeves that night, making it look like a suicide while sending a message to anyone else who might think about crossing him. The tragedy isn't just that George Reeves was murdered. The real tragedy is that the truth was buried so effectively that even today, more than 60 years later, the official cause of death remains suicide. But when you examine all the evidence, when you consider the motives and the means and the opportunity, only one conclusion makes sense. George Reeves didn't kill himself. He was murdered by people with the power to make it look like suicide and the influence to make sure the truth never came to light. The man who played Superman, who stood for truth and justice, became the victim of one of Hollywood's darkest conspiracies. And until we acknowledge what really happened, until we demand justice for George Reeves, the real villains in this story will continue to get away with the perfect crime. The question isn't whether George Reeves was murdered. The question is, how long we're going to let his killers continue to hide behind their web of lies and corruption.